Hi, and welcome to the Caterpillar Cross Stitch YouTube channel. My name's Ford, and this week I'm going to be helping you see whether you're making one of the most common mistakes in cross stitching, and that is using the wrong size needle. Now before I dig in, let's do the YouTube thing. Subscribe to the channel, like the video, leave me a comment if you learned something from me. It doesn't cost you anything and it really helps me out if you do it, so I'd really appreciate it if you take that moment to do those things. Now a lot of us, when we first start out stitching, we just start using the kit needle, whatever needle came with the kit. We don't know what size it is, we don't know what brand it is, it was just there. And then we tend to go based on feel from there, and a lot of us never really learn the appropriate size of needle to use. And the number one thing that I see people posting in online communities about when they're having problems with their stitching, the problem turns out to be the wrong size needle. So what is the right size needle? That's a more complicated question than you might think, but I can give you a rule of thumb that will work most of the time. And that is to make sure that the last digit of your fabric count, or your stitch density, matches the last digit of your needle size. And we use tapestry needles for cross stitching almost all of the time. There are a few exceptions that I'll talk about in a minute, but most of the time we're going to use a tapestry needle. And what is a tapestry needle, you might ask? Well, it's a needle that says tapestry on the package. They're designed specifically for cross stitching and other similar crafts, so they're going to say tapestry right on there. And I'll talk about a few of the things that make those special in a second. But basically you want your fabric stitch density to have the same last digit as your needle size. As those numbers go up, the size goes down with both the stitches and the needles. So if you're stitching on 28 count over 2, that's the same as a 14 count density, so you're going to want to use a size 24 needle. Likewise 32 over 2, etc. So that's a really easy rule to remember. Whatever your counts per inch is, the last digit should match the size of your needle. And you'll see these in your craft store just labeled with their size of tapestry needles. So why is it that I can only give you a rule of thumb? I can't really give you a hard and fast rule and tell you exactly what size to use. There's a lot of variation in the reason for that. So let's take a look here. And the first reason is all about the fabric. So if we look at these two pieces of fabric, these are both ostensibly 14 count fabric. But if you look at the difference of them, they're a little bit different in stitch counts. But they're also different in how big the hole in the fabric is. And that's the most important determination as far as which needle is going to work for you. A larger hole is going to want a larger needle. I want to take just a second here to remind you to join the Caterpillar Cross Stitch Stitch Club email. When you sign up, you'll get an instant download with an ebook containing 9 free PDF cross-stitch patterns in it, including a year-long temperature tracking pattern, which is super cool. You'll also get a digital download of our top 10 cross-stitching tips, and then you'll be the first to know about any upcoming projects and products that Caterpillar might have coming out, like stitch-alongs or retreats and those sorts of things. So make sure you hit the link down there in the description so that you can get all of that great information. Another thing that can vary a little bit and thus make it hard to give a hard and fast rule is that the needles themselves can vary in size a little bit depending on the manufacturer. So if we take a look here, I've got a size 26 tapestry needle right here from John James, and I've got a size 26 tapestry needle right here from Peacemakers. You can see that there is a little bit of difference in the length of those needles. You can see a little bit of difference in the profile of the tip, and you can see a difference in how big the eyes of those two needles are. You can't quite see it, but there is also a little bit of a difference in their diameter, how big around they are. And I can feel that difference when I hold them, but it's really hard to see because they're reflective. So what is a tapestry needle? A tapestry needle generally is going to have a very slight taper from the tip to the eye. It's going to have a large eye so that you can put several strands of floss in there, and it's going to have a blunt tip. It's not going to have a sharp tip. With cross-stitching, that's important because you need to be able to feel your way through the stitches that you've already done and the fibers that are there, rather than piercing through them the way you would want to do when you were doing embroidery or standard sewing. So the tapestry needle allows you to kind of feed your fibers in between the other ones instead of piercing through them. That's important for neat cross stitches that will line up and sit next to each other flat on the fabric. So now that we've talked about what the rule of thumb is and why it can only be a rule of thumb, what are some exceptions to that rule of thumb? What are some circumstances where you might plan on using a different size needle? One example that I've talked about on the channel in the past is when using metallic or specialty floss. Metallic floss especially tends to tangle and snag on the fabric, so you want to open the holes in the fabric up a little bit more with those. So you'll want to step your needle size up one step from what you would normally use when working with metallic floss. You probably also want to step your needle up in size if you're working with more than 2 strands. The rule of thumb is assuming that you're using 2 strands of embroidery floss, which is the standard. So if you're using more than 2 strands, say 3 or 4 if that's what the project calls for, then you'll probably want to use, again, a slightly larger needle to open the fabric up a little bit more so that that floss will pull through there. A time when you might want to go down a size is when you're doing backstitch. Because so much of the time when you're doing backstitch, you're stitching around other existing stitches, it's a little easier to find your way through them if you use a slightly smaller needle for doing the backstitching. It's easier to kind of weave your way through there. Plus, all of those stitches have already been pulled tight and they'll hold the fabric holes open a little bit, and there's already several pieces of floss through that hole, so it's just a little easier to fit it through if you go down one size for doing your backstitching. And for me, an exception as to when I would use something besides a tapestry needle is 2 special circumstances. One, if I'm doing a project that has a lot of fractional stitches, 1/4 and 3/4 stitches, where I'm being required to pierce through the middle of that square on the fabric, I'll usually use an embroidery needle or a sewing needle for that. Likewise, if I'm doing French knots. Because I need to go down through the fabric, not at one of the pre-existing holes in the weave, it helps to have a sharp needle on hand in order to make that a little easier. So I'll use an embroidery needle for doing French knots, because French knot is not really a cross stitch, it's actually an embroidery stitch, so that actually makes total sense. Now, learning about cross-stitching on YouTube videos is a really excellent way to learn for most people, but there is also a tremendous resource that I think a lot of us are sleeping on, and that is online cross-stitching communities. For example, the Caterpillar Cross-Stitch Instagram following and the Caterpillar Cross-Stitch Facebook group. There are tens of thousands of stitchers in those spaces with accumulated hundreds of thousands of years of experience. So if you have a question or you need help or just encouragement, those are really excellent places to go, and I highly recommend that you check them out. So we talked about the rule of thumb and why it's only a rule of thumb. So what are the exceptions? How do you know if you're using the wrong size needle for your project? Well, that comes down to what I call the 3 F's. The first is fingers. If you're cross-stitching and it's making your fingers hurt, your needle is too small. A bigger needle will open the fabric up better, will make it easier to pull your strands through, and will be easier on your hands. So if your fingers hurt, or if you find yourself frequently breaking needles, you're probably using too small of a needle. Try one size up and see how that works. Or if you're stitching and you push the needle up to the surface of the fabric and then you reach around to grab it with your other hand and the needle falls out, needle's probably too small. You should get a slightly larger needle, it'll make your life a lot easier. And the final is fraying. If you find that your needle is cutting your floss, or if you find that when you get towards the end of a cut of floss, like the last few stitches as opposed to the first few stitches, that your fabric looks kind of mangy and a little bit frayed and rough, you're probably using too small of a needle. A larger needle, again, opens the fabric up a little bit more as you pull that stitch through, so you get less friction and grinding between your stitching floss and the surface of the fabric. That is that #1 mistake that stitchers made that I talked about. They use too small of a needle because they're worried that the needle will open the fabric up too much and that it'll leave these unsightly holes in the fabric. But especially with quality stitching fabric from a good brand, the fibers will close back down, particularly when you wash the project. So don't worry about stretching that fabric out a little bit by using the correct size needle. Now, there are a few things that using a slightly larger needle can make a bit more difficult, and I have a couple of hacks that I use for dealing with both of those problems. The first thing that I do is when I'm doing a project that has only a handful of fractional stitches, but not enough to justify using a sharp needle all the time, I'll just make sure that I keep a pin on hand, usually stuck to my needle minder, so that I can use that to pre-poke that hole in the fabric before I go down for that portion of the fractional stitch. Check out the video that there should be a card for right here on fractional stitches, and I'll tell you a little bit more about that. Another thing that gets a little bit more difficult when you do step up to the right size needle is burying the ends of your floss when you get to the end of a color or to the end of a group of stitches. So if you're using a larger needle, it can sometimes be hard to get that needle underneath the backs of those stitches that you're doing, especially when you go down to a 16 or an 18 count fabric. So the trick that I have for dealing with that is to actually, when I'm done with those stitches, rather than using this needle to end it, I will unthread that needle, and I keep a second needle in a smaller size on hand, loaded up as though I were going to do loop start. See how there's a loop on the end there? I've put both ends of this short piece of floss through it. And I've used a color that I'm not using in the project, so it'll be very visible. And you'll see why in just a second here. So what I'll do is I will feed my smaller needle underneath all those stitches, and because the needle is a bit smaller, that's easier. And then I will pull that most of the way through. And then I just pull the end of the floss I just finished stitching with through that loop. Now I want to give it a little bit of slack or it will be very tight to try to pull through there. And then I just pull that all through there and then trim my floss. There is a thing called a tail catcher, which is kind of like a giant needle threader that you can use in the same way, but I like to use this method. It's pretty much the same as a technique you use to tie a knot called a sheep shank. I also use this when I'm playing floss chicken and I wind up with a tail that is too small to easily tuck. Make sure that you check out my video on how to win at floss chicken as well. So that should be the knowledge that you need in order to avoid making what I see as one of the most common mistakes that cross-stitchers and even experienced cross-stitchers make on a regular basis. What about you? Do you have something that you think I should have covered here, or a tip that you use for making sure that you're using the right size needle? Leave that in the comments down below for other viewers to benefit from your wisdom. I do want to thank you so much for watching. Please remember to like the video and subscribe to the channel. For Caterpillar Cross Stitch, my name is Ford, and I will see you next week.